Hey there, welcome to Night Lectures, your daily dose of fascinating stories. In the history of the Renaissance, there were many who sought power, but only one family managed to turn it into an art, the Borgias. They rose from the shadows and made the Vatican their home, transforming faith into politics and politics into legacy. The world saw in them the embodiment of vice, but also the reflection of an era when man first dared to place his own will above everything else. Their story is not only about power, but also about the price one must pay to command destiny. Share your ideas for future videos in the comments, and hit the subscribe button. New bedtime stories come out here daily. When the 15th century was drawing to an end, the Apennine Peninsula was filled not with the quiet of flourishing, but with the rumble of struggle. Italy, divided into dozens of city-states, resembled a chessboard where every move could start a war. Milan, Florence, Venice, Naples, and the Papal States lived under the rule of their own ambitions, and each was ready to buy, sell, or betray for the sake of power, wealth, and glory. The world of the Renaissance, later celebrated as the Age of Light, began in truth as an age of passion and blood. In Rome, where every stone recalled the lost grandeur of the empire, there now reigned not heroes and philosophers, but cardinals, bankers, and mercenaries. The papal curia was filled with men who built not the church, but their careers. Service to God increasingly became a path to power, and thus bishops lived like princes, while monasteries grew richer faster than cities. On the streets, one heard not prayers, but gossip. Who had bought a new office, who had seized an archbishop's seat, who had bribed a cardinal to vote the right way at the next conclave. Italy at the end of the 15th century had no single center. Milan was ruled by the Sforza family, warriors who had risen from mercenaries and turned the sword into a symbol of legitimacy. Venice was a republic, yet governed by its wealthiest merchants, who held the keys to the Mediterranean in their hands. Florence lived under the Medici, bankers who made art an extension of politics. Farther south, in the Kingdom of Naples, dynasties rose and fell, with the throne passing alternately to the heirs of Anjou and the rulers of Aragon. Each considered Italy his inheritance, and thus intrigue, murder, and diplomacy intertwined so tightly that few could tell where faith ended and calculation began. This made the peninsula an arena where fates were decided not on battlefields but at negotiating tables, in bedrooms, and before altars. On the streets of Florence, the preacher Savonarola called for repentance, while that very evening the Venetian doges signed trade agreements with the Turks. Europe, emerging from the Middle Ages, lived a double life, combining religious fervor with a sensual thirst for pleasure, fear of hell with admiration for human beauty. It was in such an Italy that the Spanish-born Borgia family found fertile ground where ambition could bloom. Rodrigo Borgia came to Rome not as a conqueror, but as the nephew of Pope Calixtus III, and so the doors that remained closed to others were open to him. But by then Rome had long learned to welcome men like him, those who understood that here everything was for sale, and without gold there was neither sanctity nor power. In the very heart of the city, beside the ruins of the ancient Forum, stood the palaces of cardinals. Their courtyards were adorned with marble fountains, music played in their gardens, and inside, on mosaic floors, were held negotiations that shaped the destinies of nations. One cardinal could celebrate the triumph of his favorite courtesan at night and preside over a moral commission the next morning. Contradiction had become a way of life, and no one was troubled by it. Popes elected from among these men were not spiritual leaders in the usual sense. They were sovereigns who commanded armies, forged alliances, and ruled over cities. Sixtus IV built bridges and churches not for God but to glorify the name of his family, the Della Rovere. His nephews led armies, his relatives governed towns, and his enemies often died under mysterious circumstances. After him, Innocent VIII proclaimed that there would be no more wars among Christians, and immediately launched a new campaign to reclaim lost lands. The papacy had ceased to be a religious institution, and had become a crown without borders. During this era, the word Rome once again began to sound formidable, but it was a new Rome, neither imperial nor holy, a Rome where behind every altar stood the shadow of a bargain. Envoys from France, Spain, and the German lands flocked here not to pray but to seek alliances. At banquets one could hear French, Catalan, and Tuscan, and all spoke of wars, debts, and profits. And when the choir sang in the Sistine Chapel, in the next street decisions were being made about who would become the next pontiff, and how many votes it would cost. Mercenaries, known as condottieri, became the new nobility. Men such as Bartolomeo Colleoni, Francesco Sforza, and Guidobaldo da Montefeltro forged their fate with the sword and swiftly turned into dukes. Their armies were expensive, and so popes and princes constantly searched for new sources of income. Indulgences, taxes, offices, everything was sold. And in this trade between heaven and earth, the boundary between order and corruption gradually vanished. Rome was a world of its own. Here the greatest temples rose alongside the loudest scandals. Chronicles tell how at night in the gardens of the Vatican feasts were held with courtesans and musicians, and the same people took part in Mass the next morning. Among them could be seen Rodrigo Borgia, not yet pope, but already a man who understood how this world worked. A letter from a Florentine merchant dated 1476 reads, Rome lives not by commandments, but by coins. Here gold rings louder than bells, and indeed, whoever had money could achieve anything. Merchants from Genoa and Venice invested in wine, ships, and even episcopal appointments. Artists sought patrons not among monks, but among cardinals, for they alone could afford the luxury of frescoes and marble. Yet amid this world of cynicism and pleasure, another spirit was being born. The passion for knowledge, for art, for man himself. While Lorenzo de' Medici gathered poets and philosophers in distant Florence and Rome, ancient manuscripts of Cicero and Virgil were rediscovered. The Renaissance was not pure. It lived in the mud yet reached for the light. And this contrast, between faith and flesh, between altar and wine cup, would become not merely the backdrop to the story of the Borgias, but its very essence. By the end of the century, Italy had become the mirror of all Europe, beautiful, dangerous, and ever-changing. In it were reflected all human passions, the longing for eternity and for pleasure, for power and for love, for immortality and for ruin. Out of this turbulent mixture was born a new kind of man, neither knight, monk, nor merchant, but one who believed destiny was made by his own hands and morality was a matter of profit. When Pope Innocent VIII died in 1492, a silence of expectation hung over the Vatican. The cardinals gathered for conclave, and all knew this was no election of a saint, but a struggle for power. Among them stood the man from Valencia, Rodrigo Borgia. His name was known to all. His wealth was vast, his influence boundless. He knew how to wait, and when to speak, and when to remain silent. Thus began a new era, an era when the Church would become the home of a single family, and the Vatican the stage for one of the most brilliant and dark dramas in European history. The Borgias came to Italy not as conquerors, but as those who knew how to wait. Their roots lay in Spanish Valencia, a city where Moorish and Christian worlds intertwined, where merchants and priests lived side by side, and where the word could wield as much power as the sword. Rodrigo Borgia was born in 1431 into a family that already understood the price of a church career. His uncle, Alfonso Borgia, was a shrewd and cautious man whose destiny led him to Rome, where he soon became pope under the name Calixtus III. He was the first Borgia to ascend the throne of St. Peter, and he opened the way for the rest. When Rodrigo arrived in the capital of the Christian world, he was about 20 years old, a young man with soft features, thick hair, and dark eyes, possessing what the Curia valued as much as knowledge, the gift of speech, charm, and the ability to inspire trust. Calixtus III made him cardinal and vice-chancellor of the Holy See, a position that meant control over the entire papal administration. It was already clear that this young man could not only listen, but rule. Calixtus died in 1458, ending the first brief era of Spanish influence over the papacy. Yet Rodrigo did not return to Valencia. He stayed in Rome, where survival meant more than faith. It required skill. He saw popes rise and fall, favorites gain and lose power, courtiers go from palaces to exile or the scaffold. It was a lesson he never forgot. Power rests not on belief, but on people and money. For 30 years, Rodrigo Borgia served in the Curia. Under Pius II, he managed papal finances and amassed great wealth. Under Paul II, he kept his influence despite suspicion. Under Sixtus IV, he became one of the Vatican's most notable figures. Contemporaries remarked on his extraordinary vitality, his love of pleasure, hunting, and celebration, and his ability to combine enjoyment with calculation. Chronicles tell how, during a hunt in Campania, he once saved a cardinal who had fallen into a river, and the next day secured from him a profitable concession in a land dispute. Rodrigo lived openly and made no effort to conceal his passions. He had children, more than one or two, despite clerical vows of celibacy. In Rome, this was hardly unusual. Half the cardinals had offspring, and some even arranged marriages for them with noble houses. But Borgia did it with such confidence that none dared accuse him of hypocrisy. He loved women, festivities, and art, but also money and power. He possessed what contemporaries called virtu, not moral virtue, but political strength, energy, decisiveness, and boldness. His palace on Borgo Nuovo Street was known as a place of luxury where artists, poets, courtesans, envoys, and cardinals gathered. There, negotiations took place that would never be recorded. A Venetian envoy once wrote home, "Cardinal Borgia is the man who can smile when walls are falling around him." And that was his nature. He avoided reckless risk but knew precisely when to act. When Pope Innocent VIII died, the cardinals gathered in conclave to elect his successor. It was August of 1492, and Rome sweltered in heat. The Vatican filled with carts of supplies, tents of servants, guards, and secret messengers. Each cardinal came not alone, but with an entourage of advisors and guards. In the taverns, people argued about who would win. It was less a sacred ritual than a political battle. There were 23 cardinals in total. Among them stood representatives of Italy's greatest houses, the Medici, the Della Rovere, the Orsini, and the Colonna. Each had his own interests, allies, and rivals. Rodrigo Borgia, with the vast fortune accumulated over decades, decided to spend it all. He knew the price of a vote and did not hesitate to pay it. Contemporaries claim that even before the voting began, he met cardinals privately, offering them offices, estates, and gold. Cardinal Orsini was promised the governorship of Campania, Cardinal Colonna control over several fortresses, and young Cardinal Castagna a lucrative bishopric. By the time the doors of the Sistine Chapel closed, most already knew whom they would support. The election lasted only one day. On the third ballot, Rodrigo secured the majority and was proclaimed pope under the name Alexander VI. When the doors opened, the crowd in St. Peter's Square saw a tall man in a purple mantle, his face marked by both fatigue and triumph. He blessed the people, and the bells of Rome rang out in honor of the new pontiff. The city rejoiced. Wine flowed in the streets, musicians played in the squares, and torches lit the facades of palaces. Yet in private houses everyone knew that what had occurred was no miracle, but a transaction. The French envoy wrote, "A man has ascended the throne who has bought Rome." But no one was surprised. All understood that in such an age, it could happen no other way. Alexander VI began his reign with 40 years of experience and a vast network of alliances. He was no idealist but a pragmatist, well aware that the papacy meant not only faith, but command over lands, men, and armies. On the day of his coronation, as the golden tiara was held above his head, he quietly told his secretary, "Now begins the hardest part." Many would later recall those words, for from that day onward, the Vatican would never again be merely a church. Yet even before history would call him Alexander VI, Rodrigo Borgia had already formed around himself the circle that would become the foundation of his dynasty. His son Cesare, then still a youth, studied in Perugia. Another son, Juan, lived at the Aragonese court in Naples. His daughter Lucrezia was being educated in the convent of Santa Maria di Monte. He knew the future depended on family, and prepared each of them for a role. In the first months of his pontificate, Alexander acted with caution. He confirmed the rights of old noble houses, left cardinals in their posts, and avoided sudden reforms. But within the Vatican, the change had already begun. His confidants occupied key positions, and the papal chancery became the hub of an invisible web of influence. Among his closest advisors were Pedro Gutierrez, a Spaniard from Valencia, and Giovanni Lopez, an experienced jurist who knew how to turn laws into weapons. They understood that their master disliked idle talk. He demanded results, and even his enemies respected him for it. Rodrigo Borgia possessed a rare gift. He could see through a man in a minute. He could instantly tell whether he faced a friend, an enemy, or a future traitor. That talent allowed him to hold power in an age when intrigue killed faster than poison. One of Alexander's first acts was to restore discipline in the Curia. He ordered expenses reduced, taxes reorganized, and church lands reclaimed. Formally, these were reforms. In truth, they strengthened his personal control. Revenues now passed through the hands of his loyalists, and no contract or appointment was made without his approval. But with order came resentment. The old Italian families, the Orsini, Colonna, and Della Rovere, saw power slipping from their grasp. They called the new pope a foreigner, a Spaniard turning the Vatican into a family fortress. Alexander, however, replied not with words but with deeds. He waited for the right moment, and then struck with precision. He once said, "In Rome, one must not speak loudly. One must act quietly." These words became the essence of his politics. He did not seek great wars. He preferred to build alliances, make promises, and retreat when circumstances required. That same year, he secured an accord with Naples, strengthened ties with Florence and the Venetian Republic, and within months gained recognition from the King of France. All this gave him the foundation to do what he desired most, to build the papacy not as an office but as a dynasty. By the end of 1493, it was clear. Rome had changed. The Vatican was no longer ruled by the cardinals. It was ruled by one man. Rodrigo Borgia, now Alexander VI, had raised his name to a height from which there could be no retreat. Before him lay the path to creating a new system, one in which church, family, and power would merge into a single whole. And this step would lead him to his most famous and perilous decision, to make the name Borgia not merely a name, but a symbol of power. When Rodrigo Borgia became Pope Alexander VI, he was already more than 60 years old. An age at which other men seek rest became for him a time of fullest flowering. He had long understood that power is not a grace, but the art of governing people, and he now intended to turn Rome into a center where everything obeyed a single will, his own. By then, the Vatican was not only the spiritual, but also the political heart of Italy. Envoys, mercenaries, bankers, and artists streamed into it. Every day brought new petitions, new deals, new intrigues. Alexander VI sat at the center of this web, and every thread converged in his hands. He did not strive for outward glitter, Luxury for him was not an end, but an instrument. He knew that a man surrounded by grandeur inspires obedience without words. His first step after the coronation was to strengthen family influence. He did not trust outsiders, knowing that in Rome loyalty is purchased only with blood or gold. So the principal posts went to his relatives. His son Giovanni, Juan, received the title Duke of Gandia and command of the papal forces. His other son, Cesare, was appointed Archbishop of Valencia, a decision that at the time seemed ecclesiastical, but would soon reshape the political map of Italy. His daughter Lucrezia was being prepared for a marriage meant to strengthen ties with the powerful houses of Pesaro and the Sforza. Alexander VI did not conceal that his children were not a secret but a pride. He arranged festivities for them, received them at court, and granted them palaces and lands. This astonished many, for no pope before him had dared so openly to unite fatherhood and the pontificate, but Alexander believed it more honest to acknowledge what existed than to hide behind hypocrisy. One of the most conspicuous events of the first years of his reign was his romance with Vanozza Catane, a woman of Roman society renowned for beauty and wit. She was 20 years younger than Alexander, and, as contemporaries said, possessed a lively mind, a gentle temper, and the talent to enchant. Vanozza lived in a splendid house on the Borgo, not far from the Vatican, where she received guests, artists, and poets. Alexander visited her openly, and in Rome they spoke of it as freely as they did of the business of the papal curia. For his children by Vanozza he spared nothing. When the infant Cesare was born, Alexander held a lavish celebration in his honor. In St. Peter's Square, thousands of torches were lit, musicians played until morning, and the Pope himself watched from a balcony, smiling and blessing the crowd. He saw that day not as a private event, but as a sign of the future, for in his eyes the family was the extension of his power. The papal court under Alexander VI became one of the most dazzling in the history of Italy. Chroniclers wrote that it was full of life, clamor, and color. Each day brought receptions, diplomatic missions, solemn masses, theatrical performances. Yet behind it all stood a strict system. Alexander personally approved every appointment, every letter, every document concerning lands, taxes, or ecclesiastical offices. He rarely raised his voice, but his decisions were final. He knew how to deal with people. To one he gave a promise, to another a post, to a third forgiveness. At times it seemed he yielded, but in time everything returned to him. Even those who hated him admitted that he was a man of extraordinary will. A French diplomat wrote, "He does what others fear to do, and remains unscathed." Rome blossomed in these years. Alexander invested immense sums in building. He ordered the renewal of the Borgo Nuovo to connect the Vatican with the Castel Sant'Angelo, and to transform old quarters into a city worthy of a new age. Under his rule, Rome gained new fountains, broadened roads, and artists, such as Pinturicchio, adorned the walls of the Apostolic Palace, with frescoes depicting the Pope himself and his children. In one fresco, Pinturicchio portrayed Alexander in garments shining with gold, a crown upon his head, his gaze lifted upward, while beside him stood the young Cesare and Lucrezia. That image became the symbol of a new era, a time when the family stood beside the throne of St. Peter. Yet with splendor came tension. The old Italian families saw a threat in the Borgias. The Orsini, Colonna, and Della Rovere understood that if Alexander's power took firm root, there would be no place left for them. Rumors, plots, and bribes spread. But the Pope answered with calm and calculation. He did not rush into open conflict. He preferred to subdue without destroying. Once, when a cardinal of the Orsini tried to oppose his decisions, Alexander invited him to supper. They spoke of affairs into the night. The wine flowed freely, and in the morning, the cardinal left the Vatican bearing a gift, a new title, and new lands. From that day, he became the Pope's most loyal supporter. This was typical of Alexander. He did not avenge. He turned a man around, making an enemy into an ally. But there were those who could not be swayed. In 1494, his son Giovanni, Duke of Gandia, died. His body was found in the Tiber with many wounds in his chest. The news shook Rome. Alexander remained secluded for several days, ordered an investigation, but the murderer was never found. Many suspected Cesare, though there was no proof. That death marked a turning point. Thereafter, Alexander became more cautious, more restrained, and still more resolute in fortifying his power. From that moment, Cesare Borgia occupied a special place in his life. Alexander saw in him what others lacked: intelligence, courage, and ruthlessness. He began to prepare him not for a spiritual career, but for a military one. In those years, Italy was plunged into new wars. The French King Charles VIII entered the peninsula bearing the sword and the idea of conquering Naples. Alexander acted with flexibility. First he tried to hold the peace, then forged an alliance, then betrayed allies when it became advantageous. He was not a warrior but a politician who believed that battles are won not by the sword, but by the pen and by promises. During his pontificate, Rome became the center where all the forces of Europe converged. Here, alliances between France and Spain were made, marriages discussed, lands apportioned. In a letter from a Florentine envoy of that time we read, "Rome today is not a church, but the world in miniature. Alexander knew that every power watched him, and he used it. He sanctioned or condemned wars, crowned kings, and confirmed borders. Yet for all his influence, he remained a man for whom home and family meant more than all the crowns. In 1498, when Lucrezia married Alfonso di Bisceglie, a prince of the Neapolitan house, Alexander arranged a celebration recorded in every chronicle. Processions moved through the streets, coins were distributed, fountains ran with wine, and Lucrezia herself sat in a gilded carriage decorated with the arms of Borgia and Naples. The marriage was to symbolize a union between church and kingdom, and Alexander believed that in this way he could strengthen his position in Italy. He lived in a world where every decision had a price, sometimes a human one. Yet he always preserved an air of composure. When French troops stood at the walls of Rome, he ordered the churches adorned with flags to show he was not afraid. When the curia whispered of conspiracies, he smiled and asked for more wine. His imperturbability became a legend. Alexander VI died 11 years after his election, but before that, he managed to create a system that outlived him. He transformed the Vatican from a spiritual center into a dynastic residence. His children became rulers, commanders, dukes. His name became the symbol of an age in which faith and power, the personal and the sacred, Father and Pope, merged into one. He understood that the world does not judge intentions, only results. Judged thus, Alexander VI achieved the impossible. He left not ruin, but a new reality in which the church acted as a state. His life ended in August of 1503, suddenly and almost mysteriously. Some contemporaries wrote that he died of fever, others that he was poisoned. But history remembered not his death, but the order he created. He bequeathed to his children not merely a name, but power. And now, as Rome braced for new storms, the figure stepped forward whom the father had prepared all his life, the man destined to unite sword and cross, fear and admiration. This was Cesare Borgia, the Pope's sword, and the man about whom Machiavelli would write. When Cesare Borgia returned to Rome after the death of his elder brother, Pope Alexander VI saw in him not merely a son, but the heir to his will. He had not been born to serve, but to command. His youth passed amid the luxury and intrigues of the Vatican, his childhood in a house where power was the heir and calculation the law. Yet for a time, destiny had marked him for the church. While still a teenager, he became Archbishop of Valencia, and later, a cardinal. And yet, as contemporaries noted, there was no calm of the spiritual man in his gaze. He did not know how to bow, only how to rise. After the murder of Giovanni, Duke of Gandia, Alexander hesitated for a long time, but slowly embraced the decision that would change history. He allowed Cesare to lay down his clerical rank and become a warrior. It was almost unheard of, the Pope's son, a cardinal, taking off the purple to don armor. But Alexander saw that only force could hold what he had built. Power won by the pen required a sword, and that sword was his son. Cesare was younger than 40, yet already possessed experience rare for his age. He studied in Perugia and Pisa, then in Bologna, where he learned law and the art of war. He was known as an educated man, speaking several languages, skilled in negotiation, and wielding a blade as ably as any captain of mercenaries. A French envoy wrote of him, "He acts with the coolness of a statesman and the decisiveness of a soldier." In 1497, Cesare went to France. This journey turned not only his own fate, but the politics of the Borgias. The French king, Charles VIII, was preparing to march into Italy, and the Pope needed an ally to shore up his power. Cesare went as the Vatican's personal representative, not a priest, but a diplomat. At the French court, he shone. His manners, his command of conversation, his grasp of courtly intrigues won the attention not only of the king, but also of the women of the court. Rumor had it that it was in France he first understood the value of personal charm as a political weapon. Returning to Rome, Cesare became one of the most powerful men beside the Pope. Alexander trusted him with everything: military affairs, negotiations, the governance of lands. When, in 1498, war broke out between France and Naples, it was Cesare who conducted the talks, sealing an alliance with Louis XII, the new king of France. That alliance opened the way to his dream, to a state of his own. In 1499, the Pope granted Cesare the title Duke of Valentinois, after the French land of Valentinois, and from then on, he was often called Valentino. The title was not a mere honor. It marked Cesare's new role. From cardinal, he had become a commander charged with uniting the fragmented Italian lands under Rome's authority. Cesare Borgia began his campaigns in Romagna, a rich region between Florence and Venice, ruled by petty tyrants and condottieri. The cities of Faenza, Forli, Imola, and Rimini lived by their own laws, each of their rulers considering himself a little sovereign. Alexander charged his son with restoring order, though order in the Borgias' vocabulary meant dominion. His advance was lightning swift. In 1500, he moved north with an army of French soldiers and Italian mercenaries. His standards, a golden bull on a red field, became the sign of fear. The first blow fell on Imola. The city surrendered without a fight. Then came Faenza, where the young Lord Astore Manfredi was only 17 years old. Cesare promised him life and indeed did not execute him. Yet soon, the youth died in a Roman prison. Historians have debated whether it was murder, but Italy understood one thing. Borgia left no enemies alive. Next came Forlì, ruled by the famed Caterina Sforza, a woman renowned for pride and courage. She shut herself in the fortress of Ravaldino and refused to yield. Cesare besieged it, and after long fighting, the stronghold fell. Caterina was brought to Rome and confined in the Castel Sant'Angelo. Her capture marked the end of the old chivalric world. From now on, destinies were decided not by nobility and honor, but by will and calculation. By the end of 1501, Romagna had submitted to Cesare's power. Yet he did not plunder the cities. On the contrary, he ordered order to be imposed. He appointed officials, instituted uniform taxes, and secured the roads. Within a few months, the region, previously torn by anarchy, became one of the calmest in Italy. Contemporaries noted that, for all his cruelty, Borgia created real order. But to hold such power required iron discipline and fear. For this, Cesare drew to himself a man named Ramiro de Orco, an experienced administrator, but a cruel one. He acted without mercy. He crushed uprisings, punished treason, confiscated property. Even comrades feared him. When a year later order had been restored, Cesare summoned him and said, "You have done your work." The next morning, Ramiro de Orco's body was found in the square of Cesena, cut in two. The people understood that the Pope's Duke was capable of anything. Machiavelli, who observed these events while on a diplomatic mission, later wrote, "He knew how to inspire fear and how to turn it to his own advantage." Machiavelli was indeed fascinated by Cesare. In his letters, he called him a man who understands the nature of power as few in the world do. They met in person and spoke of politics and Italy's fate. Machiavelli saw that Borgia acted not out of malice, but out of calculation. He imposed order where none existed and built a state where before him there had been only scattered feudal holdings. Pope Alexander watched his son's successes with delight. Every city taken by Cesare meant an expansion of the family's power, but enemies multiplied. Milan, Florence, and Venice feared that after Romagna, the Duke of Valentinois would press farther. His army grew. Contingents of French and local soldiers joined it. In a letter from a French envoy, it is mentioned that more than 10,000 men served under his banners, among them the finest captains of Italy. Yet fissures began within his own camp. Cesare was young, resolute, and unforgiving of treachery. Among his allies were men accustomed to changing sides. One was Oliverotto da Fermo, a mercenary who had distinguished himself in the taking of cities. He chose to move against Borgia and gathered around him a circle of discontented captains. Cesare learned of the plot and acted with speed. He invited the conspirators to a banquet in the town of Senigallia. In the evening, when they were gathered at table, the doors were barred, and a moment later, the guards entered. None of the plotters left alive. The episode became a legend. Machiavelli was in Senigallia at that time and described the events in his dispatches to Florence. Later, in The Prince, he would present Cesare as the example of a ruler who knows how to act swiftly and decisively without shrinking from blood when power requires it. By 1502, Borgia's power had reached its height. He controlled almost all of central Italy. His army stood at the borders of Florence and Naples. He bestowed titles, appointed governors, and struck coins bearing his name. In his palace at Imola, envoys, artists, and scholars gathered. He wished to create not merely an army, but a new kind of state, where order and force served a single purpose. But the destiny he had so confidently steered prepared a blow. In the summer of 1503, Pope Alexander VI died suddenly. Some contemporaries said that he and Cesare had attended a feast after which both fell gravely ill. Rumors of poison spread, but the truth remained hidden. Alexander died, and Cesare, dangerously sick, struggled for several weeks to live. In that time, his enemies raised their heads. The cardinals hastened to choose a new pope, and to the throne ascended his longtime foe, Giuliano della Rovere, who became Julius II. Cesare understood he was alone. His troops scattered, his allies betrayed him. He tried to hold power, but the new pope ordered his arrest. Borgia was confined in the Castel Sant'Angelo and then handed over to the Spaniards. After several months in prisons, he escaped to Navarre, where he entered the service of the king. There, far from Italy, his life ended. In 1507, during the siege of the fortress of Viana, Cesare Borgia fell, fighting face to face with the enemy. He died as he desired, with weapons in hand, not in chains. His body was found stripped, and one soldier, not knowing who he was, said, "He died like a warrior." Thus ended the path of a man who wished to found a new state and change the fate of Italy. His name became a legend, his image the symbol of a power that knows no fear. Machiavelli, who wrote of him, declared, "Had fortune not altered her course, he would have achieved what no one else could." Indeed, Had it not been for the death of his father, the treachery of allies, and the jealousy of Pope Julius II, the world might have seen a new Italy under the rule of a single man. But history left us not his dominion, but his image, the image of a ruler who acted without pity, yet with reason, and who became the mirror of the entire Renaissance. And ahead, in the shadow of those turbulent years, there stood another figure. Not a warrior, but a woman whose name would become as legendary as her brother's. This was Lucrezia Borgia, a princess whose fate would pass through myth, suspicion, and strength of spirit. When Lucrezia Borgia came into the world in Rome in 1480, her fate had already been written by another hand. She was the daughter of Rodrigo Borgia and Vanozza Catanei, a girl born in an age when women of noble houses were not persons but instruments of dynastic policy. Yet Lucrezia's life proved an exception. After passing through humiliations, gossip, and marriages of convenience, she became one of the most respected women in Italy. Her childhood unfolded in the shadow of the Vatican. In those years, Rodrigo was not yet pope, but he already held high offices in the Curia. The Borgia household was full of guests, music, and conversations about politics and art. The girl was taught reading and writing, Latin, Italian, and Spanish, as well as dance, singing, and needlework. According to contemporaries, she grew up a quiet and obedient child, distinguished by gentleness of character and rare beauty. Her golden hair, delicate face, and light eyes would later be described countless times, but in her early years, Lucrezia seemed more like an attentive pupil than a princess. When Alexander VI was elected pope, she was only 13 years old. From that moment, she became one of the pieces on the political chessboard. A year later, her father married her to Giovanni Sforza, a member of one of the most powerful houses of Italy, the lord of the city of Pesaro. The union was meant to strengthen relations with Milan and Florence, and the wedding itself became an event spoken of across the land. The chronicles preserve a picture of the festivities. In Rome, in the hall of the Apostolic Palace, thousands of candles blazed. The walls were adorned with tapestries and flowers, and the bride walked to the altar in a dress of white silk embroidered with gold. Musicians played lutes and flutes, and the guests, among them cardinals, diplomats, and envoys, said that Lucrezia was the embodiment of innocence. She smiled, not knowing that her life no longer belonged to her. The first years of the marriage passed quietly, but the political map of Italy shifted too quickly. The alliance with the Sforza lost its value, and Alexander VI resolved to break it. In 1497, Giovanni Sforza fled Rome, realizing that resistance was impossible. The Pope then initiated an annulment, declaring that the marriage had never been consummated. For that time, it was a humiliation, especially for a man. In revenge, Sforza spread rumors that Lucrezia had relations with her father and her brother. The slander raced throughout Italy, and the name Borgia became a synonym for debauchery. Contemporaries wrote that Lucrezia bore this scandal heavily. She withdrew for several months to the convent of Santa Sixta, where she lived in silence, reading, and praying. Understanding that his daughter had become a victim of political games, the Pope soon decided to arrange another marriage for her. In 1498, Lucrezia married Alfonso de Bisceglie, a member of the Neapolitan house and a relative of the Aragonese king. This union was intended to strengthen relations with Naples and balance French influence. The wedding was magnificent, and Alexander VI organized celebrations for the newlyweds that were recorded in chronicles across Europe. Processions passed through the streets of Rome, fountains ran with wine, and the bride was received like a queen. There were rumors that Cesare Borgia himself led his sister to the altar, and that there was a special bond between them. These rumors would later feed the myths, but at the time, they reflected only the truth that brother and sister were indeed close. The marriage with Alfonso was happier than the first. Lucrezia bore a son, Rodrigo, whom the Pope named after himself. She managed the household, received scholars and poets, organized musical evenings, and was renowned for kindness and gentleness. But the peace did not last long. After Cesare's return from Romagna, relations between the Borgias and Naples grew tense. Supporting the family's enemies, Alfonso became a political threat to Alexander and Cesare. In July of 1499, Alfonso was gravely wounded on a street near St. Peter's Basilica. He was carried to chambers in the Vatican, and Lucrezia nursed him with her own hands. Contemporaries described how she did not leave his bedside, prayed, fed him, and hoped for recovery. But a few weeks later, when the wounds had almost healed, Cesare's men burst into the room. They strangled Alfonso before his servant's eyes. This death was a turning point for Lucrezia. She retired to the convent of Santa Maria in Grada, and for a long time received no one. The Pope tried to console her, but she no longer trusted consolation. From then on, she understood that her life was bound forever to power, and that the only way to survive was to become strong. In 1501, Alexander resolved to marry Lucrezia a third time. Now, it was not merely a marriage, but an alliance that could consolidate Borgia positions in northern Italy. The choice fell on Alfonso d'Este, heir to the Duke of Ferrara. The union suited both sides. The Borgias gained an alliance with one of the most illustrious houses, and the d'Este received the Pope's protection. Negotiations were difficult. The Ferrarese court regarded Lucrezia with suspicion. Rumors about her past, about her husband's death, about scandals in Rome, aroused doubts. But Alexander was persistent. He offered an enormous dowry, 100,000 ducats, jewels, lands, and even titles. In the end, Ferrara agreed. The wedding took place in January of 1502. Lucrezia's journey from Rome to Ferrara became a triumph. She traveled in a procession of carriages, horsemen, and musicians, and at every stop, the townspeople came out to meet her. Chronicles describe her entry into Ferrara to the pealing of bells and the shouts of the crowd. Duke Ercole d'Este, her father-in-law, received her coldly, but within a few months he changed his mind, impressed by her dignity and intelligence. In Ferrara, Lucrezia revealed her true self. She transformed the court into a center of culture that drew poets, philosophers, and painters. Ariosto and Pietro Bembo wrote their verses there. Bembo, in love with her, dedicated sonnets to her. She supported schools, charitable houses, and churches. They called her the Good Duchess, and even enemies of the family conceded that she had managed to cleanse her name. In Ferrara, Lucrezia bore several children, and her life gradually settled into a peaceful rhythm. She rarely mentioned Rome, though she corresponded with her father and brother. After the death of Alexander VI and Cesare's fall, she did not return to family affairs. She lived quietly, caring for her children and for the city, which she governed in her husband's absence. When, in 1512, war broke out between Ferrara and Pope Julius II, Lucrezia showed extraordinary steadfastness. While her husband was at the front, she administered the city, oversaw supplies for the army, and supervised the defense of the fortresses. Her letters from that time survive, and in them there is neither fear nor despair, only concern and resolve. Her last years were marked by piety. She often visited monasteries, devoted herself to charity, and aided the poor and orphans. When, in 1521, she died in childbirth, the townspeople wept for her as their protectress. At her funeral stood not only the nobility but also common folk, and many said that Duchess Lucrezia died a saint. But legends did not die. Europe continued to see in her a seductress, a poisoner, an instrument of intrigue. Writers and artists made her the heroine of lurid tales in which she appears as a woman with poison in her ring and a smile that conceals a crime. The truth was otherwise. Lucrezia Borgia became the victim of a myth fashioned by politics and fear of the Borgia name. Many years later, when chronicles of the Renaissance were read in the Vatican, one historian wrote, "She was innocent, but lived among the guilty." That phrase best captures her fate. She began as a pawn, but ended as a princess who preserved her dignity in a world where honor cost less than power. Her life is the story of a person born in chaos who found peace. And when contemporaries recalled the name of Lucrezia, they spoke not of scandals, but of how, under her hand, Ferrara became a city of light, music, and peace. Thus ended one of the most dramatic destinies of the Renaissance, the fate of a woman who was slandered, betrayed, and deified. And ahead the clouds were already gathering. The family's enemies prepared revenge, allies turned away, and everything the Borgias had created over 2 decades began to collapse. In the next chapter would come the hour of reckoning, the time when the world would turn against the Borgias and their star would go out. At the dawn of the 16th century, the Borgias' power had reached its height. Pope Alexander VI ruled the church as one rules empires, and his children, Cesare and Lucrezia, seemed the 2 pillars of his world. Rome lived in fear and admiration. Even those who hated the Pope admitted that never had the Vatican possessed such energy. But the higher the dynasty rose, the more enemies it aroused. And when the force that held everything together weakened, the system collapsed almost at once. By then, Italy was weary of constant wars. The kings of France interfered in the affairs of Naples and Milan. The Spaniards entrenched themselves in the south. Venice battled for trade, and the Florentines changed allies as easily as they changed fashion. Amid all this confusion, Borgia rule inspired fear, not only for its harshness, but for its unpredictability. Pope Alexander governed the church like a state, acknowledging no one's influence. He created cardinals by selling dignities, transferred lands to his son, raised personal armies, forged marriages, and broke alliances according to the political wind. To many in Europe, he became the symbol of the corruption of spiritual authority. In the Curia itself, resentment grew. The old houses, Orsini, Colonna, and Della Rovere, had not forgotten how Alexander stripped them of lands and influence. They endured it because they knew the Pope had force and a son ready to shed blood. But behind every feast, every banquet, every victory, tension gathered. In palace cellars, in secret letters, in monastic cells where cardinals whispered of the coming conclave. In the summer of 1503, fate gave them a chance. In August, the Vatican held a banquet, one of those where wine flowed like a river, attended by musicians, courtesans, and envoys. Alexander VI was in good spirits. Affairs were prospering, Cesare was returning from Romagna with new territories, and the alliance with France seemed firm. The next day, the Pope felt a sudden weakness. A few hours later, he worsened. The doctor spoke of fever, but rumors swiftly spread another explanation. Poison. 10 days later, Alexander VI was dead. The news swept through Rome like the toll of a bell. No one wept. Crowds filled the streets shouting that the curse had ended. People looted warehouses, attacked the palaces of cardinals, and tore the Borgia arms from the walls. What had inspired terror only yesterday now stirred a thirst for vengeance. The Vatican emptied, the guards vanished, even the closest servants fled. For a long time, the Pope's body could not be buried. Envoys and clerks saw him lying in his chambers. The face was blue, the skin dark. The smell of death filled the hall. One witness wrote, "Never have I seen a body so disfigured, as though Rome itself had rejected its lord." The burial was swift, without procession, choir, or torchlight. Thus passed the man who for more than 10 years had held all Italy in his hands. Cesare in those days was gravely ill. His strength ebbed, and he could not even rise to issue orders. Those who had sworn him loyalty vanished. The city that had so recently belonged to the family turned hostile. The cardinals hastened to convene the conclave, and in the streets the standards of the Orsini and the Colonna reappeared. The choice of a new pope became the moment of truth. Cesare supported Cardinal Piccolomini, hoping he would maintain the old policy. Piccolomini did become pontiff, as Pius III, but he lived only 26 days. Illness, age, or poison. The chronicles disagree. Soon, Alexander's old foe ascended the throne of St. Peter, Giuliano della Rovere, who became Julius II. Julius II was of a different temper. He hated the Borgias not only as rivals, but as the emblem of papal shame. Upon becoming pontiff, his first act was to order the arrest of all Borgia loyalists and to strip them of office. The castles and lands given by the Borgias were declared the property of the Holy See. Coins bearing their arms were melted down, and frescoes depicting Alexander were ordered painted over. In the corridors of the Apostolic Palace, even inscriptions of the Borgia name were erased. Rome rejoiced as if it had thrown off chains. Yet with the hatred of the former rulers came a sense of emptiness. During their rule, people had grown used to order, however brutal. Now everything returned to chaos. Weakened and isolated, Cesare understood he controlled nothing. He tried to come to terms with Julius II, promised obedience, but the Pope did not believe him. The Duke of Valentinois was arrested and sent under guard to Naples, and then to Spain. Fortune dealt harshly with him. The man who had commanded armies and cities became a prisoner. Yet even then he preserved his dignity. In one letter he wrote that, "Nothing is eternal except the name." While the sun struggled for life far from Rome, in Italy itself everything they had built fell to pieces. The old seigneurs seized Romagna. The Vatican again became an arena for cardinal intrigues. The Borgia's allies hurried to the side of Julius. Those who had sworn eternal friendship to Alexander now publicly condemned his immorality. A Florentine envoy reported home, "Rome is being cleansed of filth, but with it, strength departs." It was true. For all its cruelty, Borgia power had held Italy in balance. After their fall, a new wave of wars began. French troops entered the land again, the Spaniards entrenched themselves in Naples, and in the north fighting for Milan resumed. Lucrezia, in Ferrara, lived through the events in silence. She did not engage in politics, but she knew everything. In letters to friends of that time, she wrote, "Fortune has turned against us, but no one can take a person's memory." She continued to govern Ferrara, support artists, care for her children, and avoid talk of Rome. Her court became the last island of peace while all Italy sank into turmoil. Meanwhile, Julius II, eager to erase the traces of his predecessor, launched vast projects. He ordered St. Peter's Basilica rebuilt and summoned Bramante and Michelangelo so that their art might eclipse all that had been made under Alexander. Every stone of the new Vatican was a challenge to the memory of the Borgias. But the past could not be erased. Even when their names were forbidden, people whispered them in taverns, monasteries, and embassies. Some remembered evil, others greatness. Some spoke of poisons and murders, others of daring and genius. The Borgias ceased to be living people and became legend. From that moment, history no longer distinguished truth from rumor. By the end of the first decade of the 16th century, the Borgias' world had vanished. Alexander lay in oblivion, Cesare on foreign soil, Lucrezia in seclusion. Their palaces were empty, their allies dispersed, their coat of arms forgotten. Yet behind the outward end, there remained something greater, an imprint on the mind of the age. For after the Borgias, the church was never the same. It had learned to act, to think, to govern as a state. Thus ended a power built on fear and intellect, on passion and calculation. All that had seemed unshakable dissolved into dust, leaving only a name. And the name lived on. It became a metaphor, a legend, a curse, and a source of awe at once. In the next chapter, this name will pass from history into memory, into that realm where myths are born that outlast centuries. It will no longer be about the fall, but about how the Borgias became immortal. When the last of the Borgias faded, Europe did not forget them. On the contrary, memory of the family outlived their power. Not one of the Italian houses, neither the Medici, nor the Sforza, nor the Gonzaga, left such a deep mark on the imagination of posterity. The name Borgia ceased to be merely a surname. It became a sign, a word in which fear, admiration, seduction, and mystery were joined. History swiftly changed its attitude toward them. In the years when Rome was still recovering from their fall, chroniclers wrote of them with hatred. The diarist Johann Burchard, once a secretary at the court of Alexander VI, described the life of the Vatican with pitiless precision. He wrote of luxury, of balls, of weddings, of the dispensing of offices, and of the blood that often accompanied their feasts. These records laid the first stone in building the legend, not of a reforming dynasty, but of a family that ruined the church. But time altered the tone. Within a few decades, the image of the Borgias ceased to be only a symbol of sin. Historians of the 16th and 17th centuries, especially Spaniards, tried to defend them, arguing that Alexander VI was not a demon but a man of his time, a politician who acted as all the rulers of Europe acted. French, English, and German monarchs also sold offices, forged dynasties, and killed rivals. Only none did it with such open assurance. In Italy, the Borgia name became part of cultural memory. Venetian chroniclers described them without moral judgment, but with curiosity, as a rare phenomenon, a family that managed to turn the church into an instrument of power. Florentines, who had endured Savonarola's rule and the Medici's return, saw in the Borgias not a monster but a reflection of the age. The Renaissance was a time when man tried to take destiny into his own hands, and the Borgias did so, without repentance and without the veil of sanctity. With the years, the legend grew. In the 17th century, Europe saw plays and chronicles in which Alexander VI appeared as a tyrannical pope surrounded by poisons, lovers, and intrigues. French writers turned his court into the symbol of a depraved Vatican, and English Protestant preachers placed his name alongside Judas and Nero. Yet in those same stories another line appeared: admiration for strength, will, and intellect. In an age when faith yielded to reason, Cesare Borgia became for many the model of a new man, one who shapes the world without fear of good. Niccolo Machiavelli, who observed him from within, was the first to turn the Borgias into a philosophical figure. In The Prince, written soon after their fall, he wrote, "If fortune had not impeded him, he would have attained the greatness he sought." To Machiavelli, Cesare was no villain but a model of political genius who understood that power rests not on mercy, but on resolve. From then on, his name became the emblem of amoral yet rational power, that in which success justifies the means. In later centuries, the image found new forms. In the 18th century, philosophers of the Enlightenment saw in the Borgias an example of how religion and power can corrupt one another. Voltaire wrote that Alexander VI was the first realist pope who showed the world the true nature of the church of his time. For him, it was not an accusation, but a diagnosis of the age. In the 19th century, with the rise of Romanticism, the family story took on a new, almost theatrical cast. Novelists, painters, and composers returned to their fate as a drama of love, power, and death. Victor Hugo wrote the tragedy Lucrezia Borgia, in which his heroine is not a monster but a woman bearing the curse of her name. In Donizetti's opera based on that plot, Lucrezia appears as a mother striving for redemption. It was a turning point. From a symbol of sin, she became an image of human tragedy, a woman forced to live with guilt imposed by others. Cesare did not vanish from art either. In Renaissance painting, his portraits were attributed to Raphael, though there is no firm proof. In 17th century canvases, he appears in gilded armor with an aquiline profile and a gaze turned aside, the gaze of a man who sees farther than others. In novels and chronicles, his life served as an example of how genius and ruthlessness can dwell in one person. Alexander VI remained an ambiguous figure in history. For the Catholic Church, he was long a shame, a name to be avoided. But in the 20th century, historians began to view him differently. Vatican archives open to scholars showed that many accusations were exaggerated. The Pope was indeed a politician, but he also initiated the renewal of church administration, fought feudal anarchy, and supported artists. Under him, Rome blossomed. Streets and palaces were remade. Commissions appeared that made immortal the names of Pinturicchio, Perugino, and the young Raphael. The Borgia myth proved stronger than documents. It lived not in archives, but in people's minds. In every age, their story became a mirror, for moralists, for politicians, for artists. For some, they were proof of how evil destroys even the mightiest. For others, an example of strength that outruns its time. Even today, the name Borgia resounds. Their image lives again in books, films, series, and paintings. In them, the same question returns that tormented Machiavelli. Is it possible to be great without becoming cruel? Behind the legend remains a human story. Alexander, who wished to make the family eternal. Cesare, who dreamed of uniting Italy. Lucrezia, who sought peace. Each lived in an age when the boundary between good and evil was blurred, and thus posterity remembered them not as heroes or villains, but as people who revealed the truth of power. Today, when one looks at Rome, traces of their age can still be found. On the walls of the Apostolic Palace survive frescoes where Pope Alexander is depicted in prayer, and beside him, the bull, the Borgia emblem. In Ferrara, in the old convent of Santa Chiara, Lucrezia rests beside her husband, Duke Alfonso d'Este. Her tomb bears no titles and no arms, only a name and a date. And in the little Spanish town of Viana, by the walls of the church of Santa Maria, stands a simple slab without ornament. On it are a few words in Latin whose meaning is plain. He died as he lived, bravely. It is the gravestone of Cesare Borgia, the only son of a pope whom history turned into a symbol. The circle of the family's fate closed, but memory of them did not vanish. Every century retells their story anew, some with condemnation, others with admiration. And each time the world speaks the name Borgia, it recalls not only evil, but the strength, passion, and striving for eternity that were the heart of the Renaissance. For the Borgias are not only a story of downfall, but of the human thirst to live brightly, act boldly, and leave a trace that time cannot erase. And that is why their name did not disappear, but became a myth, living longer than their crowns, their palaces, and even the very age that gave them birth.